Like Matt said, we've been working our way through the book of Nehemiah, looking at all the foundations that we need in place in our lives so that we can be effective builders with God. Now, just to clarify, when we're talking about foundation, we're not talking about the kind of makeup that you use to cover facial imperfections. We're talking about those things that builders use that are deep down underground. And because foundations are often not seen, we don't really think about them until something goes wrong. But any builder will tell you that no matter how great a building may look, if the foundations are not solid, then there is a real risk of collapse, destruction, and even death. And talking about builders, I heard about this builder who worked on a building site. And one day, at the end of his shift, he was leaving work, pushing a wheelbarrow. And as he was walking off the site, the security guard said to him, "Oi, what have you got in your wheelbarrow?" And the builder just said, "Well, you know all that sawdust that's left at the end of the day that everybody just sweeps up and throws in the bin? Well, I've put some in this little box and I'm just taking it home with me." Security guard says, "Come on, open the box." He opens the box. Guess what was inside? Sawdust. So the security guard says, "Okay, off you go." Next week, same thing happens. Security guard says, "Come on, open the box. I'm not falling for this." He opens the box, and this time the security guard has a really good look through the box. But again, he can find nothing other than the sawdust. A few weeks later, same scenario, same security guard. And the security guard says to the builder, "Look, mate, I know that you're stealing something. I just don't know what it is." He said, "Today's my final shift. If you tell me what it is that you're stealing, I promise I won't report you." And the builder said, "I've been stealing wheelbarrows." We can so easily miss something that is hidden in plain sight. And this morning, we need to ensure that we're not missing what it really means to have a foundation of compassion in our lives. We all know what compassion is, and some people are naturally more compassionate than others. But without a foundation of compassion, we're never going to build anything of lasting significance. So today, we're going to look at the compassion showed by Nehemiah and think about how a solid foundation of compassion in our own lives helps us to build effectively with God. Let's read Nehemiah chapter 5. Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, "We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain." Others were saying, "We're mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during this famine." And still others were saying, "We've had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we're of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others." When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind, and then I accused the nobles and the officials, and I told them, "You're charging your own people interest." So I called together a large meeting to deal with them, and I said, "As far as possible, we've bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles. Now you're selling your own people, only for them to be sold back to us." They kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. So I continued, "What you're doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? I and my brothers and my men are also lending the people money and grain. But let us stop charging interest. Give back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses, and also the interest that you're charging them, 1% of the money, grain, new wine, and olive oil." "We will give it back," they said. and we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say." Then I summoned the priests and made the nobles and officials take an oath to do what they'd promised. I also shook out the folds of my robe and said, "In this way, may God shake out of their house and possessions anyone who does not keep this promise. So may such a person be shaken out and emptied." And the whole assembly said, "Amen," and praised the Lord. And the people did as they had promised. So this morning, we're going to look at 3 pairs of things which are so foundational in themselves that they all start with the very first letter of the alphabet. And the first of these are awareness and anger. We heard last week how the people steadfastly managed to keep on rebuilding the wall, despite facing opposition from external enemies. However, in this chapter, the building work is interrupted, not by external sources, but by strife amongst the people of God. We need to be aware that opposition to building with God can come from internal as well as external sources. And the problem here is that the people who'd left their own fields to help build the wall were no longer able to grow their own food or make enough money to buy food to feed their families. There was no food banks or community grocers or benefits system. And some of the Jews had not only to remortgage their fields, but they'd even ended up selling their own children just to put food on the table. Some of the wealthier Jews were loaning money to their fellow Jews and charging interest, despite God's clear instruction in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 20. "You may charge a foreigner interest, but not a fellow Israelite." And rather than showing compassion, the wealthy Jews were acting callously, selfishly, and with insensitivity towards their fellow men. So Nehemiah becomes aware of the situation. Because he was spending time with the people, he witnesses firsthand the impact of the situation on the people around him. Unless we actually spend time with people, we'll never fully appreciate the extent of the issues that they face. Several years ago, I went to visit my daughter, who was working in Uganda. And although I'd watched programs on TV about Africa and I'd seen news reports about Africa, actually being there and seeing things firsthand gave me a whole new awareness and perspective on what the people were actually facing. And as Christians, we are called to be salt and light to a dark and decaying world. But to do this effectively, we need to come into contact with and actually spend time amongst the people. And because Nehemiah was joining in with the work rather than being sat in an office and telling people what to do, he understood firsthand the reality of the situation. He was aware of the challenges that these families were facing and that they were struggling just to survive. A couple of weeks back, Matt Biddlecombe reminded us of the long list of names in chapter 3 of those who helped build the wall and how the people themselves were equally as important to Nehemiah as was the project itself. And even though Nehemiah had a call from God and an important job to do, he wasn't so consumed with the project that he was too busy or too distant or too focused on his own needs to be aware of the concerns of the people around him. And after Nehemiah becomes aware, verse 6 tells us that he was very angry. He was angry because of the lack of unity amongst God's people and their lack of care and compassion for their fellow Jews. God had set the Israelites apart as his chosen people, and they were meant to live and act differently to other nations. Psalm 133 tells us how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell together in unity. But this wasn't the case here. The wealthy Jews were using the situation for their own financial advantage. No wonder Nehemiah became angry. And sometimes as Christians, we have this mistaken idea that we shouldn't get angry. We should float through life smiling happily at everybody that we come into contact with. But you know what? Anger itself isn't wrong. Jesus himself became angry when he saw people using the temple to make money instead of it being used as a place of prayer. Anger is a God-given emotion and can be a great motivator to bring about change. Rather than exploding into out-of-control rage or violence, righteous anger seeks restoration and reconciliation in response to injustice and oppression. And verse 7 tells us that when Nehemiah heard about these things, he became angry and he pondered them in his mind. In other words, he thought things through. When we get angry, we also need to take time to seek God and his perspective so that we can respond in a godly and controlled manner rather than reacting in anger. James chapter 1 verse 9 tells us that we should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because man's anger does not bring about the righteous life that God desires. Whenever Nehemiah was given new information, he always took time to pray, to consider, to plan, and to act with wisdom. Nehemiah was passionate enough to get angry, but wise enough to think things through. And this leads to advocacy and action. Advocacy means to speak in favor of, to argue a cause, to support, defend, or plead on behalf of others. The Holy Spirit is described as our advocate. And here, Nehemiah advocates for the people who are being oppressed and needed help. He exhorts those doing wrong. Don't worry, I'm not going to start all over again. He exhorts those doing wrong to turn from their sin and to help their fellow Jews. He speaks out against the nobles and officials. He calls a public meeting and he tells the Jews, "Oi, what you're doing isn't right," and that they need to stop charging interest and give back what they've taken from their fellow men. And Nehemiah doesn't just feel sorry for people, he takes action. Just weeping over things never changes anything. It's action. You got the next slide? Thanks. It's action that separates compassion from things like, oh, are we on? Yeah, use that one. Oh, I can't use a mic and turn my pieces of paper over at the same time. No, I will manage. Okay, so start again. Right, it's action that separates compassion from things like empathy, sympathy, pity, concern. Somebody once said, "Pity weeps and runs away. Compassion comes to help and stay." And the word compassion comes from two Latin words, com, meaning with, and pati, which means to suffer. It literally means suffering with. Compassion means getting involved. It means far more than just feeling for someone. It means doing something to help them, either through advocacy or action. And the Bible is full of stories of Jesus acting with compassion. Matthew 15 tells us that Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. I don't want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way." Jesus takes action by miraculously feeding a huge crowd of people. In Mark chapter 1, a leper comes to Jesus and says, "If you're willing, you can make me clean." Moved with compassion, Jesus reached out and touched him. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean or be healed." Jesus doesn't just empathize with the man's pain and loneliness. He takes action. He reaches out. He touches him. In Matthew chapter 20, 2 blind men cry out to Jesus as he's leaving Jericho. Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes. Immediately they received their sight and followed him. In Luke chapter 7, Jesus comes across a funeral procession. A widow's only son has died, leaving her not only alone, but with no source of income. And verse 13 tells us, when the Lord saw her, his heart overflowed with compassion. And again, he takes action. He reaches out, he touches a dead body and gives him his life back. And when the Bible speaks of Jesus being full of compassion or moved with compassion, it uses a Greek word, apologies if I pronounce this wrong, splanchnismai. Imagine using that one when you're playing Scrabble, splanchnismai, which means to get so touched by something that you feel it deep inside. It refers to a visceral, gut-wrenching, emotional response that is so strong that we're physically moved to action. It comes from the Greek word for the internal organs, splank, which is where our spleen gets its name. And the ancient Greeks believed that internal organs like the spleen and the intestines were the seat of our emotions. That's why we refer to things like having a gut feeling about something or having butterflies in our tummy. But nowadays, we don't say, I love you with all my intestines. We believe the heart to be the seat of our emotions, and we say, I love you with all my heart. Or we talk about being heartbroken. But whether it's our heart or our intestines, there are some feelings and emotions that are so strong that they create physical sensations in our bodies, in our inner being, in our internal organs. When Jesus saw people in need, he was moved in his inner being. He experienced splanchnismai, and he took action. When our daughter was younger, she watched a presentation by an organisation called Compassion UK, who through sponsorship show the love of God to children living in poverty throughout the world. She was so moved by what she saw, she begged us to sponsor a child. Now, at the time, we were finding it hard enough to feed and clothe our own 6 children, never mind sponsor another child. But you know what? She promised to use her pocket money and any money that she received for birthdays or Christmas to pay towards the sponsorship. Over the years, she regularly wrote to the children that we sponsored, and she developed a real heart for disadvantaged children. So much so that when she finished her A-levels, rather than go to university, she went off to Uganda to work, not just with children living in poverty, but with severely disabled children who, because of their significant needs, were considered of no value and were often simply left to die. When she returned from Uganda, she got married, had a child of her own, and then she adopted a little boy who'd been overlooked by other potential adoptive parents due to his early trauma and the possibility of him having a serious life-limiting genetic disorder. Not only is my daughter now raising her own family, but she also supports other adoptive parents who are facing challenges with their children, and she advocates on their behalf. Her foundation of compassion led to advocacy and action. And the final couple of things that we're looking at this morning are altruism and advancement. Anybody ever heard of Colonel Sanders, the American businessman who founded KFC? Well, he was on an aeroplane with a baby who screamed continuously, despite the mother and the flight attendants trying everything they could think of to get the baby to settle. The colonel asked if he might try, and he eventually managed to rock the child to sleep. As the rest of the flight continued peacefully, another passenger said to Colonel Sanders, "We all really appreciate what you did for us." And Colonel Sanders replied, "I didn't do it for us. I did it for the baby." compassion involves altruism. Altruism is an unselfish regard for or devotion to the welfare of others. It means a selfless concern for other people. It involves reaching out to others to help alleviate their suffering, often at our own personal expense. If you read the rest of Nehemiah chapter 5, you'll find that in addition to not taking the governor's food allowance that he was entitled to, Nehemiah uses his own means to feed 150 Jews and officials, as well as visitors from other places. Nehemiah was a generous man who did what he did out of reverence for God and because he was more concerned with the well-being of other people than he was with his own comfort and entitlement. Does our reverence for God cause us to live altruistically, or are we more concerned with our own comfort than we are with the needs of others? Can we really say that we love a God who we can't see if we aren't showing love and compassion to those around us who we can see? The Hebrew word for compassion can also be translated as mercy or womb. It means to love tenderly, and it suggests a picture of a mother's deep love and of giving all she's got to bring a little life into the world. Although this comes with a personal cost, something new is born. When we treat people with compassion, it gives them another chance, a fresh start, a new birth. In the story of the Good Samaritan, the Samaritan displays compassion towards a man who's been attacked by robbers. He bandages the man's wounds. He puts him on his own donkey. He takes him to an inn and he pays the innkeeper to look after him. The Samaritan's altruistic act cost him both time and money, but it gave the injured man another chance. Showing compassion often comes with a personal cost, but God repeatedly reminds his people to take care of the poor, the widows, the orphans, the strangers, to have compassion on the underdogs, on those who can't fight for themselves. William Booth, founder of the Salvation Army, was so moved with compassion for the people in London that he spent his life reaching out with soup, with soap, and with salvation to the poor and disadvantaged. Thousands of years before William Booth, God himself, in the ultimate act of compassion and at huge personal cost, sent his own son to die in our place so that we too can have a new start. When Moses received the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 34, God refers to himself as the God of compassion and mercy. We've already read Psalm 145, which describes God as gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and rich in love. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 speaks of God being the Father of compassion, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort that we ourselves have received from God. Luke chapter 6:36 tells us, you must be compassionate just as your Father is compassionate. We are capable of showing compassion to other people because God has shown compassion to us. We are required to show compassion towards others because God has shown compassion to us. 1 John chapter 3 verse 18 says, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions. Our actions and how we live need to reflect what we say we believe. Faith and deeds belong together. Now, I work in a primary school providing safeguarding, attendance, and practical support to families. And let's just say that not every family I work with appreciates the help and support that's offered. Now, the other day, I was taking some things round to a lady who's regularly aggressive and abusive towards me. And one of my colleagues says, "How is it that you're so nice to her when she's so horrible to you? The world would be a better place if everyone who says they're a Christian actually lives like you live." Now, I've worked with this lady for over 15 years. I've tried many times to speak to her about my faith, and I've lost track of the number of Christian events I've tried to invite her to, but she's never been in the least bit interested. Yet a simple, practical expression of compassion spoke to her and opened up far more of a conversation than any of the discussions I've ever tried to have with her. Actions always speak louder than words. People don't care how much we know, but they know how much we care. And when we show compassion, people will notice, will be drawn to God, and this will lead to kingdom advancement. Yeah. The parable of the Good Samaritan finishes with Jesus asking, who was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? And the reply was, can we have the slide up? The reply was, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Mercy is the fruit of compassion. Nehemiah had a foundation of compassion. He showed awareness and anger, which led to advocacy and action. He acts with altruism, and the kingdom and the work advances. When we have a foundation of compassion and show mercy to others, we will have the privilege of being builders with God, and will see his kingdom advance, both in our own lives and in the world around us. But let's not just be people who sit and listen to the word. Let's be those who go out there, get among the people, and go and do likewise.
Wonderful. If I could just have the worship team up, that'd be great. So much good stuff in there. And I'm sure God's spoken to each and every one of us in a different way. It's good to be reminded of who God is, isn't it? God is a God of compassion. God is a God of compassion. We're going to sing a song in just a moment, but I feel like it'd be great as we sing this song to ask God the question, God, how compassionate am I right now? How's my heart today? Where's my level of compassion at? And also to say, God, would you increase that heart of compassion? Because what this story tells us is that if we can truly get a hold of God's heart of compassion, then the miraculous starts to take place. Lives get transformed. People that we work with, that we live with, experience something supernatural of God's love and care. But it takes a willingness to say, well, yeah, not my will be done, but your will be done, God. So as we sing this song, why don't we just engage with God? God, would you increase my heart of compassion today? Why don't we stand and let's sing this song together?